Thanks everyone for joining today. I'm Kayla. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the partnership manager here at Start Out. Thank you for joining our Perfecting Your Pitch event with Y Combinator. We're super excited to have so many of you here today. Sorry about that. Okay, perfect. For those of you who this might be your first Start Out event, I just want to share a little bit about the organization before we get started. Start Out is a US-based nonprofit organization. We were founded in 2009 and focus on LGBTQ+ entrepreneurs and startup founders. Our mission is to increase the number and impact of LGBTQ+ entrepreneurs and also to amplify their stories, ultimately driving the economic empowerment of the queer community. Over the past 10 years, we've built a community of over 18,000 members, and we support over 400 entrepreneurs each year. Just to show a little bit more about our programming and reach, so we have our Growth Lab, which is the only LGBTQ+ specific accelerator. The 56 graduated companies have raised over $756 million in funding. We also have a mentorship program with over 300 mentors. Our Access to Capital program has over 300 investors receiving deal flow of our founders. We also host 50 events every year, just like this one. So be sure to check out the website after the fact if you want to find your next Start Out event as well. Start Out is also able to do events like this one and all of our programming because of our corporate sponsors. So I just want to thank those who made this event possible today. And now we'll introduce our speaker. So we have Kat Mañalac from YC here today, here to share about perfecting your pitch. And Kat is the head of outreach at Y Combinator. So we're super excited to have all the knowledge that she has to share. And yeah, thank you so much, Kat, for being here. We're really excited, and I can hand it off to you now.
Awesome. Thanks. And hi, everybody. Nice to meet you. I'll be sharing my screen in a second, but first I wanted to get to know you guys really quickly. So first, how many of you are at idea stage? So you just have ideas for startups, press 1 in the chat. Okay. And so how many of you have a prototype stage? So if you built something that maybe I could test out, press 2. Cool. Okay, nice. How many of you have launched products? That you'd press 3. Awesome. And how many of you have already started? Oh, congratulations, Spencer, on Thursday. How many of you have already started fundraising? So press 4. All right, quite a few of you. And how many of you have applied to YC before? Press 5 to give me a sense. Okay, it's just a few. And are any of you thinking about applying to our winter batch? Press 6. Cool, love that. Okay, I'm gonna share my screen really quick. And you are all welcome to ask questions. I'm happy to answer anything. I'll probably get to them after my presentation. So just feel free to drop the questions in the Q&A. So I can check them all out after. All right, so sharing my screen. Okay, can you all see that? Let me pull up the chat real quick so I can make sure I see it. Okay, cool. All righty. So I wanted to give a really quick intro to myself. My name is Kat Mañalac, and I am head of outreach at YC. And what that means these days are a couple things. I lead the team that does all of our content. So, hey, Kim, hi from San Francisco, me too. All of our content, video, social media, press. We help a lot of companies with their launches. And I'm also part of the admissions team. So that means reading through all the applications. These days, YC gets about 20,000 applications per batch, interviewing the companies. And so I'm happy to answer questions about that process as well. Prior to YC, I worked for 2 years as the chief of staff to the co-founder of Reddit, Alexis Ohanian, when he was running his own, when he'd started a fund and nonprofit. And that's how I first sort of got my introduction to startups. And sort of learned a lot about online community building from him. And, as you guys know, Reddit is one of the top 10, websites in the US and one of the top, communities as well. I also learned a lot about how to support early stage startups. And then, after working with him, I started at YC almost a decade ago. So that means I've seen over 3,000 companies go through the batch. And I've seen, helped many of those companies with their initial launches and their pitches. And so happy to answer any questions about that as well. Okay, so for those of you who aren't super familiar with YC, I will give you our quick sort of 1-minute pitch. So at YC, we fund startups, and most apply when they're just a team of 2 or 3 and maybe a prototype. And we help startups all the way from idea to IPO. So since 2005, we've funded over 4,000 startups from all over the world. Here are some of our top companies, some that you might recognize like Airbnb and Twitch, Instacart and Coinbase. We now have over 90 alumni that are worth over $1 billion or valued at over $1 billion. And we have 300 that are worth over 150 million. And now I think we have about 16 that have gone public, and many more that are sort of up and coming. So Startup mentioned that you wanted to learn a lot more about what needs to go in a good pitch or a good pitch deck. So that's what we'll be talking about today. This is a photo from one of our demo days at YC. Our group partners who work very closely with all the companies have seen hundreds and in some cases thousands of companies successfully pitch investors. Our program is 3 months long, but for the first 10 weeks, we say that founders should only be doing, one of 2 things, which is building the product and talking to users. But in the last 2 weeks of YC, founders flip into fundraising mode and start to prepare for demo day. So the companies that go through YC get a lot of individual insights from their group partners, as well as lots of feedback and practice. But today I'll share some resources that you can all look at and best practices that should be relevant to all founders who are going through the process of, starting to talk to investors. But before I jump into that, I wanted to just briefly mention the YC application. So for those of you who are applying or thinking about applying to the next batch, we have an application process. It's open now. The application deadline for the next batch will be September 11th. Even if you're not applying, it's just like a free online open application. And I recommend, even if you're not thinking about applying right now, taking a look at it, because it's, I think, a really good exercise to help you organize your thoughts about how to communicate about your company. And it'll even potentially help you start having some hard real conversations with your co-founders about splitting equity if you haven't already talked about that. And so I would definitely recommend taking a look at it. So we at YC don't look at pitch decks actually at this stage. We just look at the YC application. But I really think that some of the philosophy around what you need in a good pitch deck is also helpful for writing an incredible YC application as well. So this is all still very applicable. So in preparing for the perfect pitch, this is just a quick outline of what we'll kind of talk about today. But let's dive in. So before you draft, any deck or pitch any investor, you really need to nail your 1 to 2 line pitch. At YC, we really believe that people who have thought deeply about an idea can explain it clearly and succinctly. They use less words, and they can explain very complex concepts in a way that even a 5-year-old can understand. And having a clear idea is very important because a clear idea is the foundation for growth. So the best companies and movements that we've funded grew organically by word of mouth. And that's great news for all of you because word of mouth growth is the cheapest way to grow. You don't need to spend a ton of advertising dollars for that. So if you think back to the, first time you heard about, say, TikTok or even like ChatGPT, there's a good chance that you heard about it first through a colleague or a friend versus, say the New York Times. And so you want to make your 1 or 2 line pitch something so simple that anyone you talk to, sitting on, waiting for the bus, sitting at lunch, so that they can repeat it back to you and ideally repeat it to others. So in your 1 to 2 line pitch, it should be really simple and straightforward. It should cover just 2 things: what you're building and who you're building it for. So this is the actual one-line pitch that Airbnb used when they applied to YC. They said, we built the first online marketplace that lets travelers book rooms with locals instead of hotels. Second, I think, 1 to 2 line pitches should absolutely not include any jargon or, marketing language. This is a tweet that Gary Tan, who's now our president, put out, and he said, basically meaningless jargon is the #1 issue I, help startups with. It's something that we see litter a lot of one-line pitches in YC applications and investor decks. So for example, this was an actual startup description. It was, Indie Cloud is a know-how synergy platform. So don't say shit like that. That has no informational content in it. When you have a 1 to 2 line pitch, people should have a picture painted in their mind really quickly of what it is you're building. And they should have a sense of what they'd need to build if they wanted to try to launch a version of your site. So Indie Cloud, could be an ed tech company. It could be something like Slack. It could be an LMS, like who knows what it is. But going back to say Airbnb's one-line pitch, this is from very early on, that it's a marketplace, right? And it connects travelers and locals. So you might not get an exact painting, in your mind of what you'd have to build, but you have a pretty clear idea. And that's what you want to do with these one-liners. So once you have your 1 to 2 line pitch, you need to know how to clearly and succinctly answer these 7 questions. And these 7, I recommend taking a look at here. I'll share this in the chat, actually. There's a blog post that one of my partners, Michael Seibel, wrote about how to pitch your company. And he talks about these are the 7 questions you should know how to answer clearly and succinctly before you even sit down to write a deck or before you talk to your first investor. This is interesting because this set of questions is actually very similar to the set of questions that we tell startups to prepare before they talk to press as well, like tech press especially. So at YC, we do something with our startups right before demo day. So in the 2 weeks before demo day, we have something called vertebrae office hours. And vertebrae office hours are when we sit down with each company and figure out what are the 4 to 6 points you want lodged into an investor's brain when you pitch them at demo day, or when you sit down to talk to them or pitch them, or even, what are the 4 to 6 points that you want, highlighted in your deck. And I really think this is a great exercise for everyone to go through, with your co-founders, with, if you have any advisors, like sit down with them and figure out like what are the 4 to 6 most exciting points about your team, about your company, and make sure those vertebrae are like, lined into every piece of communication you do about your company. And so once you have your 1 to 2 line pitch and you know how to answer those 7 questions, and you have these vertebrae points, the 4 to 6 most exciting things about your company, I think you can easily sort of draft a minimum viable pitch deck from there. So, your MVP pitch deck can be, reasonably short, but it should have a story arc. For YC companies, we make sure their decks tell the story of the vertebrae points that they set with their group partners, those 4 to 6 points that they want lodged into people's brains. And then overall, your goal with the deck should be to explain what you do, because, investors can't get past that if they don't really understand what you're doing. And then it should be to convince the reader that this is a huge problem and it's an exciting problem and that you are the team to solve it. So these are the most commonly used slides. So you obviously have the title, which is the 1 to 2 sentences that, communicate what it is you're doing. Everyone will, if they have a launched product, or, if they have LOIs from customers, for example, they'll have, a slide that talks about traction or like the progress that they've made. Then they'll have a team slide. I think every single startup deck absolutely needs that. And usually they'll have a market or business model slide. They'll answer the question, how do you make money? And then ideally you'll have an insight. So what do you know that other people don't? And often that comes from, talking to your early users or having an insight about the space through, having experience, having worked in it. So what is, and essentially we at YC love to see your insight because, we see, and most investors and most tech press, they see a lot of founders trying to solve similar problems. So they want to know, what do you know that others, in this space don't know? These are also very commonly used helpful slides, the problem and solution and, et cetera, et cetera. But what I'm going to do next is I think we'll go through an example deck. We'll actually go through Airbnb's seed deck so that you can kind of see how all of these slides are used in practice. And I will say the initial slide deck doesn't really have to be more than maybe 5 or 6 slides. Like these commonly used slides can be sort of the outline of your story arc. But you should definitely have an appendix. Like you should definitely include some of these helpful other slides depending on the type of company you are. And you can always just include it in your appendix so that, you sort of pitch to an investor is less of like this 30-minute long pitch. It's a conversation that you ask them questions as you go. And if they ask you questions, you can reference slides from your appendix that answer them. Okay, let's go through Airbnb's deck really quickly, just to go through, a real example of a seed deck. So here is their one-liner. This was, what problem are they solving and for whom? And I think that this, really succinctly communicates that. Next is the problem. So if you think back to when Airbnb launched in their early days in say 2008, 2009, people didn't really understand the space. They came in, they pitched Paul Graham and Jessica Livingston, and Paul Graham said, what is wrong with people that they want to, sleep on someone's floor? That sounds crazy. And so they really had to it wasn't an obvious problem. So they had to sort of lay it out back then. And then the solution. So this ideally is, your insight. So, I would say like one thing, what is like your special insight into solving this problem? And then one thing I might note here is that if you notice, like, it's great to focus on one idea per slide. If you're trying to make multiple points in a single slide, it's worth splitting it into multiple. So, problem is one slide, solution is the next. And so next, it's like the big question of the day, back then was, is there a market for this, right? And so they showed, and they kind of preempted that question. They knew everybody was like, does anyone even want this, right? Is this something that people want? And so they had to show that there was a market, there were some people in the space early on. There was couch surfing. There was, Craigslist had, temporary housing listings. So there was a nascent market for what they were building, and they had to make this point really early on. They also tried to showcase that, like, here's the market size. And we'll talk a little bit about like TAM and, and that as well. Product, I don't think this is an absolutely necessary slide. I think something that I might have like potentially put in the appendix, but I think it's if you have a product built, it doesn't hurt. Business model. So this is the how do you make money question. And so this is an important thing to have. You should have a crisp story about how you could get big. So I wouldn't just talk about TAM necessarily, which is total addressable market, which they had, in their previous slide. I think you could talk about, your go-to-market strategy and other companies that you've modeled your go-to-market after. And they, Airbnb kind of did this in some subsequent slides. So they talked about a little bit about that here. So this is how, they're approaching getting users through, events they were doing, through Craigslist. They showed that there was competition. This I don't think is an absolutely necessary slide, especially if you are in a hot space, or if like people are familiar with the space you're in. It's sort of like, this is, people know it. But at the time, again, Airbnb wasn't, a foregone conclusion. Their competitive advantages. Again, maybe an appendix slide that I would have included. Absolutely important team slide. They had, a software developer on the team, 2 designers. They, they had all their highlights. This is answering like, why are you the team to do this? Press. So I don't think that there is like not a single investor I know who's like, oh, they've been in, TechCrunch or Mashable. That's a compelling reason for me to invest. So I would not necessarily include the slide. I think like maybe just include it in the appendix if you do have press coverage early on. User testimonials. So I do think user info about your users, if you have them, is great. Obviously, if you have a launched product, engagement and retention and those types of metrics are really compelling. So if you have a very engaged user base, if people come back and in Airbnb's case, if people were renting Airbnbs, more than once, I think that was a compelling thing to include. Early on, they probably just had a few users and, asked them for their personal testimonials like that. That works too. If you're a B2B company, you might want to include a customer slide if you have recognizable logos as customers, or you could have testimonials or case studies as well. And then this is the ask. So this is, they were raising a 500K angel round, and, this is sort of their projection. And that's an important thing as well. We'll talk about next steps after a pitch after this. And so, so that was their full, seed deck that they went out to investors with. And so it wasn't, incredibly long. And even some of the slides they did include, I think could have been included in an appendix. So I thought now that you've seen sort of, a successful pitch deck, I thought I'd go over some quick tips for you to think of as you are drafting yours. So first, everything on, in your slides, like all the points should be sort of like simple and obvious. And, there shouldn't be too much information on one slide. As I was saying earlier, you should try to make 1 point per slide. If you're trying to make points, multiple points in a single slide, split it up. And I would lead with your most compelling slide. So if you have a lot of traction, start with that. If you're an impressive team, I would start with that. And so, in this exercise that you do when you figure out your vertebrae, figure out like what are the 4 to 6 points, and then stack rank them. Like what is the strongest start to that story that you want to tell? Make sure to label your graphs. Investors at demo day, when they're watching, presentations, they'll tweet angrily if they see a graph that's unlabeled. So don't make that mistake. We've had enough of those mistakes that people have made. And I would generally avoid complex diagrams and screenshots, like try to make things as clean and easy to parse as possible, because people are usually only spending, less than a minute on these pages. And only include real traction, like unless you have nothing else, like don't talk about like pipeline, active conversations, unbooked revenue, like that's all stuff that you can like talk about verbally or in conversation, but it's, it makes it look like you're grasping at straws if you sort of highlight that as your traction. And then make sure, try to use consistent formatting, keep everything, fonts, colors, layouts consistent. And every slide and word should count. So if it doesn't make an investor want to invest, I would get rid of it, or you can put it in the appendix just in case you worry anyone ever is going to bring up something that slide will answer a question to. So like on delivery, I would say at the earliest stages, at the seed stage, which I think all of you are, it's hard for an investor to judge the merit of your product directly. Especially if you don't have a launched product, and often, they might not have the expertise. So as a result, they often use other techniques to figure out if you're worth investing in. So, I always recommend folks like really, know your numbers, really practice communicating, practice the pitch, make sure that you organize the conversation, that you like think through like the flow that you'd like the conversation to go in. They try to figure out, like, they try to imagine, can this person grow into someone who can, run a large and successful company. So confident founders speak slowly. That's something, it sounds ridiculous, but we have to often work with founders for weeks on getting slow enough at their demo day presentation. And especially when you have a lot of adrenaline, you're kind of jacked up and you're like speaking really quickly. So speak slowly. I would engage with the investor throughout the conversation. So don't make it a straight 30-minute, talk through. I would do a little research on the investor, understand who they are, what some of their interests in, who they've invested in before in the space. And so try to make sure, try to ask them questions as you go throughout your deck. Because the best sort of investor meetings are conversations. Like, the best YC interviews end up being sort of like office hours versus just straight pitches. And let's see. I think what I try to do, with founders is also try to preempt the hardest questions they could potentially ask you about your company or your space. And, we also do this with press as well, like try to figure out like, what are the 10 hardest questions that anyone could ask you. And then just have an internal FAQ that you sort of write and know how to answer. So you're ready for any of those questions, like no matter where those questions come from. All right. And let's see, I would say, okay, so for next steps, I would never leave an investor meeting without like a next step. So if someone says like, hey, that was great, I need to think, through this, say, that's great. Can I follow up with you a week from now? Or can I follow up with you, 2 days from now to if you want to hear more. So make sure you never sort of leave that room without a next step. And make sure to have that ask. Like a lot of first-time founders like don't actually like include the ask for like what they're raising in their deck. And so, make sure to have the ask in there. And so that, and you can even ask the investors like what they normally like, what do you normally come in at? Like, what's their typical investment size in a company of, your size? Like you can certainly ask them questions like that. So yes, never leave an investor pitch without the next step that you can, go on with them. Even if that's getting a quick no, I would say, you should go for it. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen real quick and I'm going to jump into your questions. Okay. Oh, okay, let's see. Okay, let's see. If the product hasn't been launched and you don't have traction, what are some of the story arcs founders can have? Or should you get traction and then apply for YC? Okay. So this is sort of two questions. And so for YC, you definitely do not need a built product or traction. I think 60% of the companies we fund are not launched. So, many do have prototypes, but it's not a necessity to have a launched product prior to applying to YC. For an investor deck, and even, there are companies that go through demo day and don't yet have a launched product, especially stuff in biotech or hard tech. And for traction in those cases, it really depends on the company. It's company specific, but oftentimes we'll work with a founder at the beginning of the batch and figure like, what is a good demo day goal to work toward? And for a lot of those companies, it might be an LOI. So it's, LOIs from potential customers, which are letters of intent. So you've like, a signed piece of paper that says, when you have this in production, I will pay this much for it. And ideally you'll have like a dollar amount in that LOI. Or it might be if you're, a science company or, might be a milestone of, scientific milestone you're looking to hit. So you definitely don't have to have specific traction numbers if you don't have them. But of course, it helps if you're a software company to have a launched product with traction. But yeah, you do not need traction to apply to YC. I'm looking really quickly at the chat. I heard from a friend today that YC is accepting AI applications in the last day is tomorrow. I see this info in YC's portal too. Is it a special application process or the normal process? So we just launched on Friday and it's sort of an off cycle early round of interviews for AI companies, and it is the normal application. So you would go to ycombinator.com/apply, and you'd apply there, and we're going to be doing a special round of interviews this Friday, I believe. And then, if you don't get in, if you apply and don't get in, you still have, a shot of getting into the winter batch if you apply during the normal cycle. So the normal cycle deadline is September 11th. But if you're working on an AI company, I'd say there's literally no harm in applying right now, and you might get early access to YC through this sort of special interview cycle. Okay, let me jump in. What are the top 5 things a company or product should do when starting community building? So to be more specific, what approach to use from the first 1 to 100, and then like on and on. A lot of the companies in YC will launch, their first products, to the YC batch. So that's like, their kind of cohort of companies. And then they use Bookface, which is our we have an internal Facebook essentially that connects all the founders we've ever funded. So it's about 10,000 founders now. And our founders usually launch there. So that's essentially launching to your networks. If you're not part of YC, if you have, say, a university network or, even friends and family, I would say figure out like who your early users are and like what communities they essentially live in. One of my partners, she started a company that was looking at building a device that could detect ovarian cancer early. And she was like, I didn't have, her customer was going to be doctors or OBs. And she was like, the first customer, she's like, I was her OB. Like she basically pitched her own doctor. And so at the very earliest stages, it's really just like mining your network and looking for, potential customers there. And then you expand sort of the circles. A lot of our companies will then launch on social channels. So they'll do, if there's software dev tools, they'll do Hacker News, there's Launch YC, there's subreddits, Product Hunt, and they'll get a lot of their first users there. Oh, one thing that you could all do is our companies have been finding a really sort of a successful channel in LinkedIn. It's been a place where a lot of potential customers, I guess, already live. And so, some of the companies in our last batch got a considerable number of like early users from that channel. So yeah, you kind of go from there. And once you've identified like who are these like perfect target users, then you essentially look for like, how do you find more of those exact people? And then we really, during the batch, our founders spend a lot of time like reaching out directly to every user. There's a saying we have here that's, you should find, 10 people who really love your product, like build something that 10 people are obsessed with and would be sad to see go, versus 1,000 users who are just kind of okay with your product, because those 10 people will become these viral users. And you can probably find more people like that. And so let me jump to the next question. Do you recommend having 2 different decks? One you present live to investors and one that can be sent via DocSend? I think I would just have one deck. Like, I think you can really make it simple enough, straightforward enough that, you should be able to, communicate everything you need in a simple deck. And certainly there are points that you can make live, like, and you can kind of go into things in more detail. But I would stick to one deck. Okay, so what is the strategy for presenting enough detail in the financial slides, given that it's almost impossible to view a labeled graph from the back of a room during a pitch event? This is a good question. What's the critical info to include about finances versus what goes in the appendix? I mean, honestly, I think that like demo day, we don't really go into like financials that deeply. I think it's, that those pitch events are really the beginning of a conversation. What the goal is after, you've like 1 to 2 minutes at any pitch event to pitch investors, the goal is that the investor should say like, hey, I want to learn more about that company, and then sit down with the founder to learn more about, their financials. So like at a pitch event, you would really just have like, how are you making money? Like, what's the business model? And then like when you sit down with them and in these longer decks, that's when you can go into more detail around like, depending on what company it is, like it would be like, what is the cost of acquisition, what is, COGS, like, whatever metrics you're tracking with regards to that. But yes, for pitch events, it does not have to go into enormous detail because you just don't have enough time. And, it's just a beginning of a conversation. So can you apply to YC with a soft launch product? Absolutely. And I would definitely do that. Okay, what if the problem needs more explaining, i.e. it's a women's health specific problem? It's a good question. So I would say, I think you can explain it. You definitely need a slide, like you definitely need a problem slide that explains like why it's a problem and how big of a problem it is. And just assume that you are pitching to people who have no knowledge of the problem. And so I think it's, I would definitely check out one of my partners, Sarna, just wrote a book called Without a Doubt. And it's about her story building a women's health company. And, it got acquired by Boston Scientific for $275 million, but it talks a lot about the specifics around like, how did she go about, and she got 100 no's from investors, honestly, like trying to explain, the scope of this problem and why she was the person to solve it. But she did it successfully. And so I would definitely like read that book and take some notes from Surby. So how do you access the book Without a Doubt? I'm going to really quickly just drop a link here so you can see it. She also, I'm trying to think of, has some videos on YTC's YouTube channel. So if you just Google Surby Sarna, stuff will definitely come up. So next question, what level of details on funding should we share in the pitch deck? So your ask slide. So I would say it's like you make sure to have like, how much you're raising, and like really, I don't know that you need to have too much more detail. Like you could go into more detail when you speak in person. You can, and if you have like, I would go with like at YC, like normally we have like, here's the target that you'd like to raise. And then the backup, like if you don't raise that, there's like another amount that you just absolutely need to keep going. And so I would always go with like, what is your target amount? And hopefully, you've talked to some people that can help you set that number for yourselves. Does YC help if a company is not registered yet? Yes. We definitely fund companies that are not incorporated. And there are a lot of like online, whether that's Stripe Atlas or Clerky, there are a lot of online tools that can help you do that. And co-founder. Okay, so do we help if the co-founder has not been finalized? So I will say that we do fund solo founders, but we've seen over the years that it's just so hard. If you look at our top 100 companies, I think 4 or 5 are founded by solo founders. It's possible, certainly possible, but it's just so much harder. So we highly recommend that you start a company with a co-founder and that you apply to YC with a co-founder. We even built something called the co-founder matching platform to help founders meet each other. I'm gonna put a link to that because it's we've actually funded quite a few. I think in the last batch we had something like 13 companies that we funded where the founders met each other on this co-founder matching platform, and it's one of the hardest things, to be honest. Like it's not. I think someone said Clerky is awesome. That's great. I'm glad you found co-founder matching. So we've had a lot of successful matches made on the platform. It used to be as background for everyone, this used to be a controversial thing because a lot of people, I mean, even internally at YC, believed that you couldn't meet a co-founder like online. And over the years, someone made the point, they were like, people are meeting their life partners online, right? People that they spend the rest of their lives with. And so if you end up meeting someone online that you might want to, get married to or spend the rest of your life with, it's like, why wouldn't you be able to potentially find a co-founder? So we decided to launch it a few years ago as an experiment. And now we see it's starting to work. Okay. Another question, should the founding team share their personal motivations and journey in the pitch deck, or keep it a more business problem solution focused? I think if you want to add that, I would keep it like more business problem solution focused. But if you want to add that as like one line in sort of like your founder bio that's included on the page, that's fine. And certainly I think that'll come up in your, conversations with investors. I think it's great to in YC applications, we ask like why you're working on this problem. And we love to hear that because we want to understand, like, what is your motivation? Like, do we believe this is a team that's going to be working on solving this problem for the next decade? And so if you have a personal connection to the problem you're solving, I think that's great. So question from Malvina is, what are you looking for in when you're accepting someone who's pre-product? So one thing is, as I mentioned, we love teams. So we love a well-balanced team, at least someone on the team who can build the product. So if that's most of what we fund are, probably software. So if you're pitching us a software product, ideally there's someone on your team that's technical that can build it. Ideally the team, has someone that we believe can sell. So like someone who, and you don't have to have experience doing that, but someone, hopefully the application and the communication that we have in interviews is sort of clear and succinct. And we think you've thought deeply about, the problem that you're solving and the solution that you're pitching us. We look at sort of how the co-founders met and, what makes them, sort of what's their insight, impressive things that they've done in the past that are not necessarily connected to this company. But if you've done something that you're really proud of before, we ask that as a question, like, what's something impressive that you've built or achieved, to give us a sense for, what you're capable of. And, if you're working on something, we love to see domain expertise too. So if you're, solving a problem that you understand because it's a problem that you came across at a prior job or at, something you researched at school, that's also great. And yeah, we understand that ideas change. So a lot of people pivot, like not hard pivot, but, a lot of ideas are sort of flexible in the early stages. So we're married less to the idea, and early we're very interested in the team and sometimes we'll even ask for other ideas. So if we think the team is strong, but we have, doubts about your idea or are skeptical, and we'll often ask like what other ideas there are that you might want to sort of dive into if this doesn't work out. All right, so Mike, I prefer to bootstrap. Do you see people using a pitch deck to succinctly tell a story and gather interest from possible future investors just in case? I think like, I don't think if you really don't want to, raise from investors, I don't know that why you'd necessarily spend the time. And ideally sort of like you bootstrap and you like make enough progress that you don't need to like do so much like investor pitching. You don't need to like run a process. Like hopefully like at some stage, like investors come to you. But yeah, I mean, like you could, if you want to just organize your thinking around a lot of these questions, like maybe just make a deck and like if someone comes inbound, you may as well, why not try? But I wouldn't spend a ton of time pitching investors if like you want to bootstrap and just like build product. I think that's great. Just do that. From Mike, how important is founder market fit? So if my team is doing, if you're all new to a field, especially in AI, is that attractive to YC? So in this case, traction is a way to show others we're a good fit. So I would say, like, as you know, obviously, like, we're not hung up on like, you have to have like 30 years of experience in a space to like build something interesting in it. Like, if you really think about the Airbnb founders, like they had 0 years of experience in hospitality or, building that kind of product in that market. So yeah, I wouldn't worry too, like, I think founder market fit is like, I think it's like, we want to see like, what is your like connection to that problem that you're solving? Like, as I was saying, and as in the answer to the previous question. And yeah, if it is something like deeply technical, obviously you'd want someone who is a technical expert in that space, I think. And yeah, if you don't have that, like, for example, I think, as I said, we do fund solo founders, but often solo founders have to do a little bit of more work up front to prove that they can build something on their own. And so that's probably similar. Like, if you really don't have anyone who's an expert in the space that you are, pitching a company in, you might have to do a little bit more work up front to launch something. But again, I wouldn't count yourselves out. Is the AI application the same one for September? So yes, it's the same application as I mentioned. Let's see. If you are in an industry that is more regulated, specifically healthcare, to what extent do you need to show clinical trial results, regulatory approvals, patents, HIPAA compliance? Folks really apply very early stage. So these don't really matter, at some of the earliest stages. And that's, we have a fairly large community now of bio and healthcare founders who can help you through some parts of this process. And certainly Survey, who's our group partner, who I mentioned earlier with the book, she's gone through all of that, and, helps a lot of her companies navigate, FDA approvals, all that. She has great expertise in that. Okay, so Felix asks, for a Web3 project, does YC only invest in equity, or can it be in the combination of equity and tokens? So we have a standard deal. I'll link to it here. And I will link to it in the chat, but that's our standard deal there. So we just do like the standard deal for all companies, no matter what type of company it is. Okay. Let's see. Solo founder companies. Okay, so yes, I think we talked a little bit about that. Is there a possibility to get mentorship or guidance or advice from YC's team before applying to YC? So many folks these days apply that we can't give like personal feedback to everyone prior to their application. If you get to interview stage, we do give feedback. Like, if you get in, obviously you get in, and if you don't get in, then we send you specific feedback on why that is. And then a lot of companies will go and sort of iterate based on that feedback and then come back and apply again. And if we see that they've made a lot of progress since the last time they applied, then that's a great signal. And we often ask them to, interview again. And I will say, for anyone who's applied to YC but not gotten in, I would definitely apply again. I think something about like over 50% of the companies that we fund have a founder on the team that has applied more than once. So don't count yourselves out if you've been rejected, once by us. Let's see. And yeah, I will say, like, if you know YC alumni, they're extremely helpful. And so I would definitely, reach out to them, reach out to the alumni and ask them for feedback on your application or any advice. If you get to interview stages, they can help with that. All right. So it says, Nicholas, I'm not sure if you're still there, but I think only half of your question came through, but it was something about something like a crowded space. You said something like in mental health where a 2.0 solution is needed. I think only half. So if you want to put your question in chat, feel free. Let's see. Does YC invest in Vice, cannabis, et cetera, or in biotech set, offer consumer product, OTC, and prescription? We have done consumer products. I'm actually not super up to date on our like Vice. We have funded cannabis before, but I'd have to double check with you on that. That's a good question. Are solo founders with domain expertise using no code for the initial build MVP considered? Yeah, I would say we do love to see, technical folks on the team or an intention to bring on a technical person, because even if you're using no code in the beginning, like I think the idea is that you would at some point outgrow that and would need to start building but certainly, I'd say like Parker Conrad, for example, from Rippling, his first company, Zenefits, he sort of like learned just enough to build front end to kind of show people what he was thinking about. And then, that's how we got in. And so I would say don't count yourself out if that's, if that's the profile you are, a, solo founder with domain expertise, but, kind of using no code at first. Let's see. Oh, okay. So how would you recommend sharing market differentiation where space seems crowded? Ah, yes. Okay. Yeah, and so I think if you're in a really crowded space, the thing that we love to see, so we love learning new things because, 20,000 applications come in every 6 months. We're processing a lot of information from founders and often founders who are in, similar spaces. Like I remember in 2015, I interviewed like 5 companies building like the Uber for babysitters, right? So it was, so I would say like, what we look for there is that we want to hear that insight. Like from, in that case, Uber for babysitters, we're like, if you have a launched product, we're like, what have your early customers said? Like, why are people using you? What is the approach that you're using that perhaps others in the space aren't? Like, what is, what is the, and hopefully your team shines in some way that you can highlight. Because yeah, I think it's all about the team, obviously. And then hopefully you have some insights from talking to customers or potential customers that like other folks in the space don't have. Oh, another thing that I didn't even mention is we do really look at how quickly you're moving. So if you apply to YC, for example, one batch and you don't get in, and then you apply the next batch, but you show a lot of traction or you show a lot of progress that you've made in that 6 months, it's super impressive. And your likelihood of getting an interview is very high. So in the case that you are in this like hot space, I would say like it would, it's important to show, strength of team, speed. And if you have insights that you think are new or different, you definitely highlight and share those. Let's see. All right. I think, let's see. For pre-seed meetings, thoughts and best practices around live demos. Oh, I would definitely like, if you have a demo that shows a feat of strength or like something that, it makes it very obvious like how well your product is working. Like, I think having a demo ready is great. On the YC application, we ask to see a demo video. And then sometimes in interviews, we don't always have time to get to them, but sometimes in interviews, we'll ask to see a live demo. And so I think, you don't necessarily, like you could basically like just even have a Loom recorded or something where you could show what your product is doing and like, talk through it. If you launch on something like Product Hunt, that is definitely something that they would recommend unless your product is something that is easily self-service that people can all try out. But if you don't have it, you can certainly, have a demo video attached to your launch. So yeah, I'm very pro. Let me see if there's any other questions in the chat that I didn't get to. I think there's some more questions here. I will say that if I didn't have a chance to get to your question, you can always email me. I'm kat@ycombinator.com. And yeah, if you have any questions, I hope to see a lot of you applying to the next batch of YC. As I mentioned, the deadline for the next winter batch, that's winter 24, will be September 11th. And you can also apply late. We sort of read applications up until the batch starts, so really till late December. But I would recommend, if you can, applying on time. Okay. I want to thank you guys for having me apply.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kat, for your presentation and being generous with your time with all those great questions. I feel like we got to every theme of question that was asked, and they were really great tonight. So thank you. And thanks everyone for joining and for being such an engaging audience as well. I think, yeah, Kat shared her email and the link for the application if you all want to stay in touch with YC. And then on the Start Out side, we hope to see you at another event as well. And thank you so much. Have a great rest of your evening. Thanks,
Good to meet you all. Bye.